Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 35 of The Only Way is Ethics. Welcome back to everyone that's listening. Really looking forward to chatting to our guest today. So without further ado, we'll crack on. Just to let everybody know, obviously you have found us on YouTube and Spotify, and we will continue to have more episodes coming up, and we'll tell you a bit more about what we're doing as well after we've had a chat. So I'd like to introduce Kultar Garcha. And Kultar, welcome. Thank you ever so much for joining us on this episode. So we'll hand over to you, if that's okay, just to tell us a bit about yourself, your background, your clinical background, and some of the great stuff that you're doing with neuromodulation.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me, Dean. Great to be invited. I'm a GP. I carry on working as a GP alongside my other roles, but have a small practice in West London. Actually, it's my dad and I. It's about 6,500 patients, and I've maintained that even through my journey in digital health as well.
Right.
So I guess where and what was that transition like? I love general practice. I love being there with the patient. But there was always that limitation. First of all, things like the waiting lists, problems, access to treatment, referring on. I've always been really interested in technology, and I guess this was more about two things. One, if over the course of my lifetime practicing the way that I was, I'd like to think you'd impact that patient population. So it might be a few thousand, which is amazing. What a privilege to be able to do that. But then I also thought, I want a bit more. And I don't mean that sort of sound greedy, but how do you take that and say, right, if I've learned all this, built up this experience, what about 10x that amount? How do we utilize and best use the experience that we build up and make that at scale? So I thought, well, digital health and using technology and innovation is the best way. Now that also is at the individual level. So we know that technology is becoming increasingly adopted. In practice, I was seeing more and more people use the internet, wearables. I use those gadgets as well. And so it was more like, okay, well, let's combine both. Let's get into that and explore it more. So that led me in 2017 to join Babylon. So that was my first real exposure into the digital health space. And I joined at just a great time. It was a few months before the launch of GP at Hand. So I was involved in some of the setup of that, doing the first consultations and really bringing what was really a very different model. Now we have telephone triage, we still do telephone consultations in primary care, but adding video actually was really important. I think it really has a different type of consultation. Just being able to see, we always get taught in medical school and everybody knows around non-verbal communication. And this was just that opportunity to say, right, well, we can do that, and from the comfort of somebody in their own home, not having to come out into clinic. So that was at the consultation level, but also then how we were taking that elsewhere. There was another team on the product side, a number of other doctors and other clinicians working on building the product side and the app of how do we utilize that stuff, the triage tool, the chatbot that we had, and how can we combine those both and get data from users and then bring it up so that we are moving away from reactive sick care and trying to really get into that preventative space. Now there were loads of ups, and inevitably, like with every organization, there were some downs as well. Some bits of where we scaled, how quickly we went to different markets, but worked with a brilliant team, getting involved on the product side, operations, clinical, governance, safety. How do we do that in the digital thing? How do we build out toolkits? How do we educate doctors on assessment in a way in a digital space? How do we look at audit? How do we audit digital consultations? So our consultations are recorded. Patients could then see the consultation after that happened, because so much of it sometimes get lost. That then I left there, and then I went back into general practice for a bit, and then I took up a position when I'm still a committee member at NICE. So I work as on the quality standards committee, basically, and I'm one of the standing members there. So we look at the new guidelines that come up, and then how can we turn that into quality standards that organisations can then hopefully work to. Not just in the NHS, we see private organisations work on that. Do a little bit of work on organisation called WONCO, or the Global Family Doctors group as well, looking also at quality and patient safety. And my main role now is Chief Medical Officer at Flow Neuroscience, and that is beyond just the digital, like software side, in medical devices as well. So we have a headset which treats depression. So very much in technology now, into devices formally, but I've carried on and I continue to do normal general practice. And I feel it's really important to still do that in a leadership role, to make sure you're still on the ground.
Absolutely.
At the front line, because consultations now are very different even a few years ago, like with even AI. A lot of people are coming in having researched this, used AI tools, and if you're in positions of leadership and you've been sort of 5-10 years out of clinical practice, you actually don't necessarily have all the insight, at least the first line and front line evidence of actually how this plays out. So you're advising on technology, advising on use, but you don't actually know exactly how it's being used and what the nuances are. So really important to, I think, carry on with that.
No, absolutely, and thank you for that. And it's an interesting journey from sort of like that, and I think it's really important that you've hit a sort of like a note there in relation to remaining in practice and being current in relation to that. I mean, I've been sort of like, the audience know, been in digital now coming up for 20 years, and we see it a lot where you've got clinicians that unfortunately they've been clinicians for like 5 minutes, and all of a sudden they jump into digital, and they're not practicing. I mean, and I can confess myself, nurse background, but I haven't practiced since 2020 in relation to that, But yes, I've gone down that different path. But we're always exposed to, in the regulatory space, to sort of like people like yourselves and the organisations where they're steeped in teams that are still practicing in relation to that. And I think it's really, really important to sort of like, to get that across to the audience as well, which I think you have. So how does that sort of like, position you in relation to sort of like innovation and sort of like looking at different sort of like technologies? You've got this GP practice, obviously very successful with sort of like, a lot big sort of like, say, 6,500 patients in relation to that. There's still a lot of patients to sort of like manage in relation to that. And I think we're very much in a place at the moment, aren't we, where we're very reliant on the patient now in relation to giving us information. We've gone from that sort of like space where sort of patient used to, like, you sit in front of patient and the doctor tells you sort of like exactly what's happening, what's going on, what's going out, and you go out the door with instructions and a plan. Whereas now they're coming more informed in relation to that. I heard a story the other day when because as you know, we train, and you've been on our training, and interestingly, it's sort of like GP saying about the patient brought their own AI technology to the sort of like to the consultation in relation to that, and it's like it's almost sort of like completely flipped on its head, hasn't it, in relation to that.
And it's really, I think it's really welcome, right? So I think we get told that we throw these terms around, shared decision making things, but again, it's one thing having a concept and having these phrases. It's very different than sometimes implementing them, and I don't think we've gone far enough. Like even the way we measure outcomes in healthcare, how patient-centered really is it? I don't think it is.
It's not.
I mean, one of the great things, and this is before I even joined Flow, one of the best things that was implemented, many, but one of them was we force people every time they're using the headset on a weekly basis to do a patient-reported outcome measure.
Okay.
So we have a mandatory in-app. You cannot carry on using the device until you get that update back.
Yeah.
Now, this is using a validated tool. That's great. But what about more? What about capturing what's really important for that individual? Because every time you see somebody, a patient, their circumstances means their interpretation, how that health or how that condition impacts them, is going to be different. So how do we actually measure that? How do we measure what's important for them alongside what's important clinically, and get to a place where we are then working together to get to the right outcomes? We're not there. We need to get there. There's whole things around, the safety aspects, how much data we get, what type of data, where they're going for data. But I still think this is in its infancy. Proms, prems, those type of measures, we need to see a lot more of it.
and I'm in the thick of that as well, which is sort of in relation to, I've got ulcerative colitis, so I've got a long-term condition, and you talk about patient outcomes in relation to that, and I feel, just in my experience, that you're absolutely right. We're not doing enough. And it's quite frustrating at times because, I don't mind saying I'm under King's College, and they're absolutely fantastic. The team there are just second to none, and my experience with the whole sort of like treatment. However, when you're in crisis and when you're sort of like, and you need responses and you want to give information, what kicks in is this sort of like questionnaire type sort of workflow then, isn't it? And I almost feel like it's a bit robotic and it's very impersonal, because all you're asked is questions around sort of bowel movement and stuff like that, and it's very, very sort of like, the word I'm looking for, it's just very stale and very sort of like in relation to that. And then you want to go on to sort of say, well, actually my experience over the past 2 weeks has been, and you're almost cut down to sort of like, I need to get this information from you, and then I've got other people to speak to. And that's sometimes the feeling you get. And I'm almost like, now there's an organisation that's using Epic in its sort of like, they've got My Chart, which has its like sort of, it is great in relation to a lot of its functionality, but also if you don't switch on certain aspects of it, or you're not going to use it effectively, then what benefit is it giving to the patient in relation to that?
Well, exactly that. And so a lot of the time is, now I see a lot of value in some of these scores from a clinical perspective. So sometimes, again, even with mine, I might send out a mood survey beforehand, or I'll send a questionnaire on urinary symptoms. But it's one thing getting that information and then saying, but what about how it's impacting you? Just to, like, you're the expert in your own colitis,
absolutely,
because you're living with it all the time. You go and see a specialist at King's, you go and see your GP, people with conditions come and see me. I might be an expert in the knowledge of the science behind it, the pathology, what's going on in some of the management. But I sure as hell I'm not the expert in how they are living with that condition. And that marrying up hasn't happened enough. And technology can help. It's not, I think it's making a lot of progress. We need to be able to digest that information. We need to be able to measure it. But most importantly, we need to act on it. And then see and confirm, is that actually having that effect? So if we get all those insights from you, so we have a really extended conversation, you're at King's and they had a good half an hour to really understand your experiences, then it's the so what. What does that mean? How does your management change? What changes so that you can inform them more on how things are going day by day, not just a routine follow-up 3 months or 6 months later, because the system says so, but actually it's more dynamic and it responds to how things are. And whether that's from data on what that you're submitting or some other form of remote monitoring, it'd be lovely to get in a position where that type of stuff can see more, we can see that more in the healthcare system. I have 10 minutes. I have 10 minutes in a consultation.
Yeah, I know.
I do 15.
Yeah.
So I've changed my practice to do that, which is amazing that I can do that. It does mean I see less patients in a normal day. But even then I'm struggling for time, because with all this information, if I then really want to explore what's happening, digest it, explain it, educate, make sure that there's understanding on both sides, then arrange follow-up, that's limited time already.
Yeah, it is. And I think there's lots of GPs out there, aren't there, that I know from my experiences with my GP, it's very varied. I see GPs and they're quite happy for me to be in there for sort of like, 20, 25 minutes if you've got sort of complex things to talk about. But I'm also conscious that I, as a clinician myself, I sit there sometimes almost wanting to say to them, I've taken up too much of your time, so like I need to go. But I think we are getting there. We are moving on. There's lots of technology available to us and to patients as well in relation to that. Now, interestingly, you talk about sort of like your role as chief medical officer for your organisation, and you know, there'll be people out there that look at sort of like, you know, may have a perception of that CMO role in relation to, oh, it's all about clinical endorsement. It's just there as a sort of like a figure to sort of like, you know, I'm the CMO and sort of like, you know, our product's great. But you and me know there's a lot more to that within sort of like, you know, there's the day-to-day grind in relation to sort of like, you know, strategic positioning, patient safety, as you said, to products, design, development, etc., and so on and so forth. And talk us a bit through sort of like, you know, what that's like for you in relation to that role and some of the challenges that you face.
It's a really privileged role. I'll start with that. And there's loads to it. There's lots of which I'll address. But I think the first and foremost thing to say is the role of the CMO is to be the strongest patient advocate. That's got to be your core, that's got to be the center. Everything else then goes around that. You're part of a leadership team which may or quite often won't have that clinical experience, may not have patient direct contact. They all want to do, with all these organizations, we want to do the right thing by patients, and everybody is a patient as such, everybody's a user of the healthcare system. But when you're doing that and you're in an amazing position to be able to influence that at scale, that's your primary role. So in our organization, we get a lot of feedback. We use that feedback. So again, guided by the user, guided by the patient. But at the moment when you're looking at strategy, when you're looking at where we go next, when we look at the evidence, the primary role of the CMO is to be the strongest patient advocate. Then what do we do? So, you know, what is my role? I've got an internal role, and then we have an external role as well. And sometimes it's hard to juggle both. But if we go on the internal, so everything from, so at Flow, we're a regulated medical device. There are responsibilities that we need to have just from regulations, but again, they come from the right place around safety, around outcomes. So measure what we're doing, good and bad. Every decision that we make in healthcare as well, there's always a risk benefit. In fact, most of the times we do risk benefit analysis. So it's that, well, what is the benefit? How do we measure the benefit? How do we measure the benefit at a population level, at an individual level? Are there particular groups that are benefiting more or less? Why and why not? So looking at that, all the safety and the vigilance aspect. So all the adverse events, learn from them, understand them, reply back to the users, understand what's happened, what the reasons for that are, what they are, and then look at the trending. Is there something that can help influence or improve product design, so we could limit that as an example. Same even on the software side. So this is not just limited to medical device, but we're looking at even from clinical services. Is there something we can change about the pathway or the tools that we use to improve, so that again we're lowering the risk as much as possible? Get involved in product development, so both on the hardware side, both on the software side. We're looking at strategy, which markets to go to, which indications, what's the latest happening in the research more broadly in the space. How do we bring that in again to the organization? I talked about the proms and prems. How do we measure? How do we become more patient-centered? So that's all a lot of the internal stuff. Then the external touches on, well, there is a commercial role and we have a commercial team. How do we go out? What claims do we say? What do we put on the website? That all has to be grounded on the fact and all that stuff that we've talked about before. We don't want to overpromise. We don't want to undersell on claims and safety as well. So as much as all the benefits, we need to be honest and transparent of, look, this won't work for everybody, and sometimes you will get side effects. So what does that actually look like? Going in when we're working with new organizations, potentially, so both in the private and public sector, going out to different markets in different areas of the world, so being involved in the strategy element from that as well. So it's a brilliant, privileged role that covers internal, external, patient, what we define, where we want to go, what's the new research, what's the new tech that we're going to develop. There's a lot.
Yeah, there are lots of moving parts in relation to that and a role, and I think sort of like some of the people in the sort of like audience, I'm hoping they'll sort of like, you know, looking at those roles now, that there's a lot more to it and you're a lot more involved in relation to that, which brings me on to the sort of like you already mentioned around sort of you know, something that we'd know as post-market surveillance and sort of like the importance of that vigilance side in relation to that. And I think it's key in to get the message over to sort of like any of the audience that are listening that are in that sort of software space. And I know that I certainly train in relation to that and try and reiterate the importance of when you switch a system on, or when you're live, or when it's marketed in relation to that and it's out there, that, you know, it is so important that you're getting that information back, that it's coming back into the system, into the organisation as well, to sort of like, you know, you already mentioned that risk benefit analysis in relation to that. It's listening to like the patients, the users, getting that information, feeding it back in to constantly improve in relation to that, especially in the sort of, you know, the patient safety and the clinical safety aspects. So looking at sort of, you know, neuromodulation, you know, regulated clinical intervention in relation to that, so what has that journey been in relation to that? Because it's, you know, it's probably new to some people. There's probably some people out there that don't even know what neuromodulation is, and the benefits that it can play, not just for what you're doing, but other aspects which we'll talk about a bit later with my own experiences.
Yeah. So neuromodulation has been around for a long time, and essentially it is, I mean, we'll break the term down. So modulating or helping change the way the neurons work or the nervous system works. Now, I say a long time, as an example, ECT, that's been around for a long time. That is a form of neuromodulation. It relies on also something called around neuroplasticity, and that's that remarkable ability of the brain to change. Now, we thought brain development happens and pretty much stops at around 21, 22 years old. Not the case. In fact, all throughout life, plasticity and the ability for our nervous system and our brain connections to adapt and change is lifelong. Yes, a lot of it, of course, happens in childhood and early adulthood, but actually it carries on after that. And we know that from after brain injuries, things like stroke and things, the ability to adapt. So in areas or states where there is an option to basically change some of the way that works, that's what we mean by neuromodulation. And that can be through different devices. So ECT mentioned, that's a form of electricity, it's an electrical shock. Actually, Flow, the device we use, is also electric. So it's we're saying sort of electric medicine. Our nervous system works through electricity. Our brain is an electric organ. It communicates through these electrical signals. We're providing another electrical signal, a very weak one. It's 2 milliamps. This is why we're able to do at home as well, but it's the same as a 9-volt battery. And what it's doing is just giving a little bit of a nudge, a small external electric current to help just change the way those cells are firing. What we're indicated for, so our form of neuromodulation, transcranial direct current. Transcranial just means it's a wearable, it's not an invasive. The direct current is that it's a constant 2 milliamps, and then it is stimulating, and what we're doing is we're stimulating a part of the brain called the prefrontal cortex, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex on the left side. At a population level, we know that people who have depression have lower activity in that region.
Okay.
It's not everybody with depression, it's not a diagnosis. If you have that, that's what's going to happen. But at a population level, that's what we find. So by using neuromodulation, by sending a current there, we can increase the activity levels in the area, and we see pretty good results in people's mood and other aspects of executive functioning, memory, concentration, sleep. We notice improvements on that.
Okay, That's fantastic. It's great. And in relation to that, then, so you're on this journey. You've got patients out there that are using that. So let's talk a bit about sort of, you know, how that sort of the classification of something like that. Does it fall into that sort of, you know, because some people could say, is it sort of like, you know, from what you've explained, oh well, that's general wellness in relation to sort of like, is that sort of the classification, or does it go a lot deeper than that into sort of like, you know, a different sort of classification of that device?
No, we've been very clear, and we maintain this, that we go through, and we are very much evidence-based, evidence-informed. We have gone through the regulatory process in every market that we're in. We've gone through. So we're a 2A medical device in the UK and EU.
Fantastic.
We got Class 3 PMA a few months ago, so the back end of last year in the US, which is amazing as well. So we've gone through FDA approval. We're in Australia. We went through with the TGA and got approval there. So we've made a very conscious effort that we are going for regulations. What does that mean? So we have an indication. We have a specific type of condition that we're going for. It's depression, and that's what the device is indicated for. Now, so we are not a wellness device. We're not something that you'd say, you know, just here we are, here's all these claims that we I'm not going to say made up, because some of them can be formative evidence, but maybe if I take just makeup as an example, sometimes you'll see at the bottom, you know, 90% improvement, and you look at the survey of 8 people or 12 people. No, we've gone through an RCT. So Flow actually conducted the largest ever double at-home study into TDCS, into the technology we use, published in Nature Medicine. And what we did was look at comparing somebody who's using a sham device, who still gets a very small stimulation for a short period of time, against those who are having the active treatment. And we went through that, and we're building, you talked about post-market surveillance, we're continuing to get the evidence for all of our users as well. All anonymized, but because they have to provide that survey results, we can see how their mood is changing. Most of them better, but even if things are worsening. And then where they've granted consent, clinicians, if they provide consent, their clinician, who they choose to work with, can also then monitor and see what's happening, and they can adjust the treatment. But yeah, just going back to the study, so after 10 weeks, people who had moderate or severe depression, some of whom were already on antidepressants, some who were not, but as a whole group, 57.5% went into remission.
Wow.
At 10 weeks. And we noticed effects within the first 2 or 3 weeks. We could start to see that downward trend.
No, that's absolutely fantastic. And I think what we'll do for the audience as well, you mentioned that paper and the research that you've done. When we put the episode out, we'll put a link to it if you can make that available to us. It's absolutely great. And in relation to that and the research that's been done, and like totally know you're not sort of like in that wellness space, and it's very specific in relation to what it's doing. And I think it's great, because I think it's really important that we also raising awareness around this, because we're looking at, and especially two of us sort of like sitting here, men's health, depression, massive, don't talk about it a lot as well. So I think it's an important part in that space, and I think, you know, we were chatting before the episode sort of like upstairs. You know, I've had recent experiences, don't mind sort of like saying about it, sort of like, you know, it's tough out there for, I think, everybody, you know, and we need to have more available to us to be able to assist. And I think when you look at where we're at in at the moment, and, you know, I know, you know, people that go and have conversations with their GPs, and you've probably had conversations with sort of like patients around sort of like potential like depression, etc., and stuff like that. And sometimes there is a tendency to go down that pharmaceutical sort of like route in relation to that. But I think a lot of people would really sort of like look at the benefits of, you know, if you said to them, look, we've got this, give it a go and try it. I know I'd rather sort of like totally sort of like, if it's something that I put on a sort of like, you know, a daily basis in relation to that, rather than someone saying to me, well, is a bottle of tablets that you can sort of like take and do that. I know I'd be in that space, definitely.
But, so I think, absolutely agree. Part of this is also just going to your point. First of all, you need to be confident enough to get that access. Now, by all accounts, all measures, about half of the population who have depression in this country are still undiagnosed. So have they been not be able to access it, or is it because of many issues, not just stigma, but they don't feel that they want to go and share that with a healthcare professional? Now, we have been so the device in this country, you can buy it over the counter. You don't need to have you don't need to go through a doctor to access it. And this touches on the safety element. So our reported side effect rate is less than 5%. And when we go through all the regulatory process, again, this is the stuff that they look through. Is it safe enough that this can be used at home, can be used without prescription? And we've met all of those standards. But then that does mean on access. So you said, if we look at depression more broadly in the country, usually it's a ratio of about 3 to 1 female to male. But if we look at our users, and we've got over 60,000 of them, it's a 50-50 split.
Okay.
So actually, a lot more men are using the device. Now, I think this speaks to, again, partly because they're not going, but also I think there's something about, look, this is a gadget, this is tech. I mean, this is what I like.
Yeah, totally.
And also it's quite empowering. You can choose when you're going to use it. And it's at your time of day, in your control. You don't have to have a prescription. Now, look, I'm not anti-medications. I still prescribe these medications. But my options pretty much right now in primary care, NHS primary care, are two. It's therapy, talking therapies, and medications. Both of those can be fantastic, but both of those can also not work for people. Medications do have a lot of side effects, sometimes long-term or even lifelong, even after stopping. And on the point of stopping, they can be really, really hard to stop. So they can be life-saving, but also I think we need to, just talking about risk or benefit, we really need to spend time explaining that, look, you can have some real benefits. This can be life-saving, but I just want to make you aware of some of those risks. Now, I've changed my practice on this, and this is partly because I've been in that space and researching a lot more. I wasn't, if I go back 10 years, if I go back 10 years, even 5 years, I wasn't having a good conversation or a really open conversation about sexual side effects, for instance, with some of these medications, and that you can have sexual dysfunction for many, many, many years, even after stopping these medications. I think that's really important because it's so, sex life and sex generally is such an important part of life. So if that's being affected, that can help. That can contribute, of course, to low mood and things and relationship issues, which is big. So how often, how many doctors spend time really sort of giving that information before they prescribe? Many people won't have them, but I think this is the stuff that we need to do. Same for blood pressure tablets, same for diabetes medicine. We need to be very clear about these are all the benefits that you can get. And then it comes to the patient being a patient-informed decision. They may say, I've looked at this, and on balance, you know what, I'm not really keen on this. Now, for me, there's another option, and Flow's there's the other option. And again, we're just saying any one of now these three options, at least at first line level in primary care at my setting, we've got just another option. And I see so many people, just like you just mentioned, saying, oh, you know what, yeah, absolutely, I'll give that a go. It works within a few weeks. This is what the stats show. Very few side effects, no serious side effects to date. Let's try this. It doesn't mean we're stopping those. It can be added on to those other things. I've a number of patients on antidepressants who we add this on in preference of increasing the dose or adding a second medication in.
No, that's it, and it's great, and I think it's really good that we've got more options in relation to that. And like you said, especially for me, medication isn't the answer necessarily, is it, in relation to that? So coming back to sort of the regulations and stuff like that, and look at evidence, claims, and sort of like that responsible adoption almost, and you spoke about sort of medical device regulation. You spoke about FDA approval, which I know some of the audience will know as well. That's quite that's no mean feat. You've got to go through sort of like a lot of hoops in relation to that. What has that whole regulatory compliance and assurance process been like for you as an organisation? Because obviously I'm steeped in it. It's what we do, but obviously we do find in the UK especially, we're at a point this year where medical device regulation is changing. I'm hoping, touch wood, for the better in relation to that. DCB 0129 and 160 is being revised. We're supposed to see it out for public consultation, but we're at June now. It's supposed to come out in February. So any of the NHS team that are listening out there, please can we see it sooner rather than later, because people are getting a bit tetchy. But it is a changing landscape, and we will come on to talk about sort of like artificial intelligence at some point as well. But are we, in your experiences, are we steering people away from the UK? Are we stifling innovation, or should we embrace sort of compliance?
Compliance, this comes back again to safety. And again, I'll come back to what is my role. I've got to be the patient advocate. So we've got to be safe. We've got to be grounded in that. Regulations are there for a reason, but regulations also need to keep up, and they need to be applicable and they need to be implemented. Now, there was that study a few months back. I think you've mentioned it on one of the previous episodes. Sam Shah, Keith Grimes, Yusuf, and things as well. Looking at basically just implementation of these things and saying that it's not there. So we've got all these standards, right? We've got all these standards, but are they actually being followed? And is somebody being measuring them? And then is anybody accountable if they're not being? And that's missing. Now, how I bring that back to regulations. It's been great to work in it. We went through MDR, we've done the FDA, I mentioned the TGA and things as well. We've been working in the UAE and looking at the regulation pathways there, and in other markets as well. They're really quite different. Everyone is quite different. So then it can be very hard for an organisation. These aren't, and nor should they be. It's not meant to be easy to go through these things. But I think a level of standardisation and knowing if you do this, this is what it will lead to. It's very hard to get those answers. Now, even when we work with the notified body, they can't. I understand it, but also find it sometimes challenging. So they can't actually tell you, when you put a submission in, they can't tell you actually what to change or what's maybe wrong or missing in the evidence. So they're not allowed to offer that consulting. But we're working with the notified body. We want to work with them in order to pass these things, but they can't do that. I mean, that's really frustrating on our side. So then you've got to have somebody else. I mean, we've got an excellent regulatory person in our organisation, but to have the knowledge of working in, again, all those other markets, so then we have to get other people involved, and external consultants and things as well. It's an expensive process. Again, I'm not saying this should be cheap. We have volunteered. We want to do it in the right way. But when you're looking at even doing a study for this, sometimes costing hundreds of thousands or more, over a few million, a decision does need to be made. Like, look, you want to carry on as a business, you want to grow, but you want to survive. And if then you're really struggling with how do I actually survive, then I can understand, I don't endorse it, but I can understand why some organisations might say, right, well, I'll go down a wellness route first. I'll do this first. I'll do a class 1 and get into the market before, because we wanted to get that, because then we can build some of the evidence needed in order to get that. And there is a difference, and I'll be, I don't think I'm wrong in saying, I'm going to say, but I think there is a different standard to medications and just pharmaceuticals than there is to medical devices. So on the I think the burden of proof from a regulatory perspective is far greater. I think then a lot more needs to happen.
Far greater for medical devices.
Yeah, far greater for medical devices. And the burden of proof is a lot more. It's not about just a non-inferiority trial and saying, right, that's my route to market, I can go. And even when you might have these approvals, it's far harder to get adoption. So medical device being adopted, any medical device, I'm just talking about Flow, but in the pathway, the system isn't set up for that. It's easy to add another drug onto the formulary, because it's part of the implementation. Get a device in, and it has all those things. Yes, the 160. What does that look like? How does the pathway change? So even when you go through all the regulatory burden, when we're stuck with then the implementation, the cost effectiveness, how do we set these things up? We will always go through regulatory approval. We are doing that. We're going after the indication. We're very clear about that. That's what our company is set up to do. We know what that means, but I just wish it was keeping up with what it is. I think, for instance, I think a lot more needs to happen on post-market. I don't think it goes far enough.
Totally.
I think there's so much preloaded on before approval happens, and then you're basically sort of left. I mean, how much actual post-market surveillance happens on even medications, let alone medical devices?
No, absolutely.
What's the burden of proof? You could have incidents. How are even they reported? Yellow card scheme. Black. How many? I mean, I've hardly ever in my whole clinical career, I've not done many yellow card incidents because it's long, sometimes quite time consuming to do. They are listed in the side effects, so there's no real need then to add it on. But actually, I think there should be. We should do a lot more of that, and then we should be learning and things. I welcome what NICE did a few months ago to say, look, we're also going to look at, even if approval has been granted, it may be that we look at it and say, actually, no, we're going to take that away. It's not once you're on for life.
Yeah,
That's ridiculous.
Yeah, it is. It is crazy, and I think there was even something that came out. I think it was a LinkedIn post that I saw, and there was some sort of stats that came out about sort of AVTs and AI sort of like technologies, and around how many incidents had been raised in relation to those, and the percentage is just it's nothing. There's like minimal. And I think it was even Dom Pimenta from like sort of who put it out there and said, why are we not seeing more? Surely there's like sort of, what is the issue of people? I think he was right. It's an awareness issue in relation to that. We're now sort of like pushing out aggressively our sort of like the deployment of AI technologies, and the awareness within the population is lacking massively. It's absolutely not necessarily in private sector, but in the NHS it's huge, absolutely huge. Therefore, if you've got a population that's not informed, then how are they going to sort of like, they don't know if something's hallucinating, is drifting, is creating bias, etc. So we're not going to see these coming out. And in the revision, it's a bit of a soapbox moment, but you spoke about 160 and sort of like, and 129, and then sort of if we look at the digital technology assessment criteria, DTAC, version 2 has come out, and they're pointing us in the direction of learning from the patient safety sort of like events. So it's DATIX using that. Yeah. And if you look at DATIX, it's not fit for purpose in relation to raising digital health issues, because it doesn't have the data set, and we're at risk, and they're going to get missed, and they probably are getting missed at the moment. So I think we're in that space. I completely understand what you're saying around the sort of like the adoption of, and you're really sort of like all about promoting sort of like regulations, and you're taking that proactive stance in relation to that. But obviously there are many of organisations that can't do that from a cost perspective, startups, and in relation to that. And we're are we, should there be more support centrally in relation to that? Are we doing enough in the UK to be able to support organisations to just get on that ladder in relation to that? What was that experience like? I don't know, were you in Flow from the very beginning, from its sort of like conception, and how hard a journey was that to sort of like just start that process?
Yeah, so I wasn't there from the beginning. I've been there just under 3 years now.
Yeah.
We were going through a lot of the regulatory stuff even when I joined, and I've been carrying on with that since, even up until now.
Yeah.
But I do know how challenging it was, having spoken to the founders who are still there, and so forth. So look, it's been a real struggle.
Yeah.
And to your point, I think absolutely, I think there needs to be a lot more help centrally. Straight up, I'm a absolute supporter in that. But then we've also got to think about what the consequences are. Now, I think it's about a couple of months ago. So all the AVTs. Now I've got my own feelings. So the way I consult, it hasn't really helped me, because I normally use 2 languages. Usually, just I have a ethnic, quite high ethnic diverse population in my area, so I won't consult only in English. And then I get it, that technology is improving, but at the moment it doesn't actually help. So I will just dictate afterwards. But I've given that feedback. But if I were to log that feedback in a formal way, all the time saving, actually probably more than that, all the time saving I would have had from using it, and it's definitely helping productivity and things as well. But I'd lose that if I were to go through all the reporting things. So, from purely personal perspective, I've seen that the technology is great. It's really improved across all of those. Tortoise and Tandem and Heidi, and you've got a number of them. But I've just reverted back to the way I do it, which is dictate afterwards. But then, even if we support these organisations, and the decision was, right, we might then nationally implement a big tech company to do this. So you give them all the support, they spend all this money, they're invested, they get their data, they work through all the pathways, they do everything the right way, and then this big player comes on and it's just done. We've recently had to your point again about being patient informed, very recent, this whole thing with Palantir and the FDB. Again, I don't think we've been informed. I wasn't informed well enough. And again, those decisions are made, but really, how have we shared, how have we got people on board? That also needs to be part of it, keeping up with it, and just making sure that people understand how this technology is going to be used, how it is already being used. How do they, and then they can make an informed decision on whether or not they want to opt out. Can they opt out? We haven't had those frank conversations, or we're not having them enough. Certainly not at a central level.
And that's interesting, because we're in some ways slowly are we reverting back, we're regressing in relation to, I've been in sort of digital for like 20 years, so I was around in the national programme for IT, and for those that do remember that wasn't the best of experiences in relation to sort of like IT and the choices being made. And are we almost sort of reverting back to that way? And I think maybe I'll just sort of like put this out there, that are we being sort of, are ICBs being forced down that route in relation to where we've reduced the number of ICBs, and where we've got these groups that are sort of like emerging, then the discussions are, will it just make sense that we all have the same system in relation to that? Therefore, we're almost being sort of like, they're being not forced, but they're looking at it and saying, well, does that make sense? It might not make sense though in relation to that. I don't think people are challenging. They're just sort of like, oh well, that decision's going to be made and we'll go down that. And if we do get sort of like you say, one AVT sort of like offering, and all of a sudden that becomes the sort of like the NHS sort of technology of choice, and you will take this, and it's like, well, we've done that, we've been there. It cost us 5 billion in relation to that. Do we really want to go down that sort of like that road? And if you look at, I had a conversation yesterday with a really good sort of like company, Jennifer Lyle. They've got a product called Symmetric for testing and validation. It's amazing looking at it to support UAT. They're in 27 trusts, but she was talking about the whole Epic revolution, in the Americas, and it has become just sort of like they've just taken over. But if you look over here, I think the Apollo project, when they look at the total cost of that, which was King's College, Guy's and St Thomas's and Royal Brompton, 220 million. It's nearly £250 million, when the next option, even if you looked at like nerve centre or sort of something like that, is probably 10 times less to implement that. How can we justify what we're doing? And I'm really worried about the direction of travel in relation to this, because I'm not really, I thought I was getting quite some positive vibes in relation to DHSC and the sort of like the dissolution of NHS England. But some of the stuff that I've seen, and I spoke to you about sort of like, some of this HSJ stuff that had come out, and someone talking about their Tsar-like sort of status and things like that. And I'm just really worried. I don't know what your views are in relation to that.
We are absolutely reverting back. I've got examples. I mean, look, so I in my at our ICB. I mean, let's even talk about ICBs. I don't know what's happened with budget. Can they spend? Can they not spend? There's no clear direction. Can they make decisions? Where's actually the commissioning happening?
Yeah.
How does that fit in with neighbourhoods?
Yeah.
I'm none the wiser. I've asked the question.
Yeah.
I mean, even from even a flow perspective, trying to get an answer when we're looking at commissioning. So we can't actually answer you. So why isn't that just shared nationally? So look, we don't know. It's better to just be open about it. Don't hide away from the fact that some of this implementation hasn't happened okay. It's not okay to not have an answer or hide behind something's changing or pass on to somebody else. About a couple of weeks ago, no, it's a bit longer, for digital for triage, the triage tool for general practice, our ICB wrote to us and basically said, these are the 3 tools, the 3 products that you can choose from. Pick one. These are the ones that are procured. We already have a tool which is not one of those 3. So we wrote back and said, well, we don't want one of those 3. Will you fund this? No, we've already been through the process. These are the ones that that they won the tender. So it's one of these 3 you can choose. If you want to go on your own, tell us which one it is, and then you're self-financing it. I mean, that's outrageous, right? It works for us. We went through a process as well.
Right.
Now, if there are issues with that provider, then tell us what those issues are so we can be aware of it. Are there issues around ISO standards? Is there something on that side? What actually was it? Can't get that answer.
Right.
Now, another example, I want to, now we'll name the system. So the 2 in primary care by market share, over 90%, TPP System 1 and EMIS.
And EMIS, yeah.
I've been a System 1 user. Our practices use System 1. In our ICB, all practices bar 1 who use EMIS were on System 1, and that was a decision made at the CCG previously, and then and so forth. Certainly, in the CCG level. I really like the look of Medicus. I want to move from System 1 to Medicus. I think, exactly to your point, not only is it cheaper, but it's far more grounded in actually what is useful for patient care.
Yeah.
If we remember, these EHR systems, the likes of Epic and Cerner, they're fundamentally for billing and coding. They're for the admin side. They're not there. They've made it a lot better, but their core function was not around having the patient at the centre.
No.
And this is what I've seen, and I haven't adopted Medicus, so I can't say it, and I'm not advocating and sort of a support because I haven't used the tool, but I want to move away. How do I do that? Get in touch with the ICB, discuss it at the PCN level. It's a real challenge. Like they've gone through all the certifications, they are able to, but again, it's about how do we change? What support? Because we work as we're one practice in a system. So when other people are seeing patients that are in my surgery, they need to communicate. And the reporting that needs to go out as well, but you can't even get those answers in an easy way. So again, it is reverting back. It's basically, this is the system that you choose. You can technically move away, but we're going to make it really hard.
Really tough for you because they've monopolised the whole sort of like sector.
Yeah.
And interesting you talking about Medicus. So I had one of Clive Flashman's dinners I sat with the medicus sort of like guys and talking to them, and they found it really hard, sort of like, you know, getting into the sector. NHS wanted to embrace, I think, them coming in, and then EMIS and TPP Optum sort of like they put the sort of, you know, the kibosh on it. They've got that power, unfortunately. IM1 integration and the whole scale and stuff like that. You're at the mercy of them. It's not the NHS teams that cause the issues, it's them. And look, yeah, we are saying it, but it's fact.
I mean, part of the reason I wanted to move away from TPP System 1 is because of all the controversy that happened, and it did, you know, well, it's called The Only Way is Ethics. From an ethics perspective, I didn't feel that was appropriate. I don't think the right consequences were there. But even if we had a framework, the changing and having that implementation that people can easily move, it's the hardest thing ever in primary care to move EHR.
Yeah.
You know, the great work Equity Charter is doing was precisely because of that. And I think we need to think about all these companies, and I'll put Flow into that as well, but we need to have that dimension of, yes, you can meet standards, absolutely you should, you've got to have patient at the core, but what does patient at the core mean? You have to then act equitably, and you need to have those standards. How are you measured against it? You can say it, again, it's not about sound bites, I'm fed up with sound bites. How do you actually then do the implementation aspect of it? Now, this is exactly why when we're looking at the Palantir and things, you know, the conversations do need to be had. Everybody's position will be different, but at least have a conversation about it. Then how do we build that into a framework? And then if something changes, how do we say, right, we need to reassess this now? We reassess data all the time based on post-market surveillance.
Yeah, absolutely.
So where's our standards on an ethics and moral level as well? Now, I may or may not want to move away from System 1, but if I do, how easy is it for that to happen? And if the system is so difficult to do, the easier thing for me to say, oh, you know what, I'm just going to carry on because I've got so much other work to do that I can't change.
And that's so frustrating, and so sort of like that we have to take those attitudes in relation to what we want to do, because, you know, why are we not part of a system that embraces change and allows us to move if we want to? They keep talking about interoperability, and it's like sort of absolutely key to everything we do, but it's failing on so many different fronts in relation to that. We're not interoperable across the sort of like across the NHS. We're far from it in relation to what we're doing. You know, access to information, yes, it is improving, but are we at the point where we're sort of like, you know, we've got the confidence if you walked into any organisation to get treatment, most of them wouldn't have a clue. If it was outside of your area, they wouldn't have a clue, and you'd struggle, and that's putting people at danger in relation to that, which brings me sort of like, you know, back into that sort of home-based treatment, and looking at sort of like, you know, how does that, because lots of things that, you know, you're doing, so in Flow, it's all home-based, isn't it, in relation to that, which is absolutely fantastic. But how does that shift sort of like risk in relation to that? Are we more sort of like, you know, the responsibility, is it shared between manufacturer, clinician, patient, and those adopting organisations? Not just with Flow, but sort of like also with, you know, the adoption of artificial intelligence and maybe bringing in sort of like, we've got lots of different initiatives, haven't we? Remote monitoring, virtual wards, etc., and stuff like that.
No, look, I think it would be dangerous, and I think, no, it is not, it would be, it is dangerous to just say, right, there's no now clinical responsibility. We're just reducing the overall responsibility gone because it's not in a clinic setting. Now, the main thing that Flow was able to do is take a traditionally clinic-only treatment and make it into a form factor which can be allowed to be used at home and can be used first line. That doesn't mean there isn't a responsibility for us to make sure that this is still meeting all the safety standards and the clinical responsibility of the device as if it were in clinic. So yes, we get the data, yes, we can monitor the data. Now, that's also not taking away the clinical responsibility of the doctor and the clinician. I have lots of patients of mine who are using Flow. I'm not then saying, right, my clinical responsibility for the management of their depression is now the responsibility of Flow. Of course it's not. I hold that. I am using this just as I were using medication and using, if I refer to talking therapies, they're on my list, they respond to, I have that clinical responsibility. I am working with them to do shared decision making. We have agreed a path to use this. We educate them on how to use it at home. Now it's so easy enough that I don't need to be involved in that conversation. That's why they can buy it over the counter.
Yeah.
They're able to do that. We have all the safety information, how to use it, when to use it, what to do, what if things go wrong, a support team. So we can't walk away from that.
Yeah.
We can't say, here's a device, we've done our part in manufacturing it, now you're on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And then if you've got any issues, just always go to your doctor. Which is why we are always getting in all the data back, both for, again, improvements and benefits, but all of the side effects and building on that. And what do we do with that? Quality improvement. This is a continuous cycle. It's not when an audit happens, let's compile this all, let's do a quick complaints log, let's do a hazard log and just do it because an audit's happening. No, this is a living, breathing process document that we're implementing and improving on all the time so that risk goes down, benefit goes up.
Yeah, no, and that's absolutely key. And like we said before, that whole post-market piece, and it's really interesting because you already alluded to the fact that there's so much emphasis on proactive sort of risk management in relation to in the design and development life cycle, but it almost seems when we switch a system on, everyone sort of like backs off, not necessarily from a manufacturer's perspective, but I do see it as well. I think you're absolutely right. I think post-market surveillance, or whether you want to call it not in the medical device space, post-deployment monitoring, same difference in relation to what they're doing and its intent, is done quite poorly overall, and we need to have more emphasis on that. Where are the where are we in relation to sort of accountability, coming onto that, and in relation to sort of like coming back to the AI side of it as well. Not just accountability though in relation to sort of, and we'll come on to sort of like AI, but accountability of sort of health organisation practices and manufacturers in relation to not medical device regulation, because I think there is accountability there and there is that assurance and it is legal in relation to that, but more so concentrating on DCB 0129 and 160. It's very weak in its sort of in its adoption. We already know in relation to sort of like you said that piece of work that came out from Keith Grimes, Youssef, Sam Shah, 70% of technologies don't have, I know that's in secondary care, but if we looked at primary care,
it'd be even higher. Of
course
it would be.
It would be sort of like in the 90s, wouldn't it, in relation to that. I reckon you'd probably get a response back, it would probably be around the sort of 5-10% sort of like of in relation to that. And that's not us, look, I'm sitting here sort of like grinning and stuff like that, but it just makes to me it just makes a mockery of what we're trying to achieve. We're pushing, we're the 10-year plan, whether that's still going to be a thing on the way the government sort of like, can we still talk about the 10-year plan as and in the same sort of like in that same discussion and in the same vein as when it came out, because going from sort of like acute to community, from analog to digital, etc. and stuff like that, we're trying to promote that neighbourhoods you already spoken about, but we've got to have the technology to be able to do that. But it's almost like implement it, worry about the risk sort of like after that, like the event. And is there any recourse? Is there any accountability? There's none. It's not regulated in any way, shape or form. And people say yes, it is. It's self-regulated. So, but if you don't have the knowledge within your organisation to do that, then it's not.
Of course it's not. Every GP practice is meant to have a CSO, right?
6,500 of you.
Yeah. So look, and it was great. I was again very fortunate enough to come along to your training. You can go on other courses which are far shorter, far, far shorter. Now, what we covered in 2 days, even that was,
Yeah.
it wasn't skimmed, but there was so much more we could have done. Like, you could
totally.
easily turn this into a week course.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
to think you can do this in half a day or a day, again, it's just ticking the box. And that is just unacceptable. Right? If you're going to do something, you do it and you see it through and you see the implementation. I can go around and say, right, I've got a certificate now, I'm a CSO. If I'm not going and implementing the changes of Flow, if I'm not going and adopting that into primary care, then I shouldn't have that certificate and I shouldn't have that endorsement. But that's actually what is being measured, really.
Yeah.
Have you done it? Have you just got a name? Is that box ticked? And that's happening across the board. It happens with the implementation. If you don't have people checking if the regulations are met and if this is done in the right way, and people leading some of that sort of transformation, and who's taking that accountability, who's the actual named person, you can't even get a name of who's implementing. In my area, who's the named person for neighbourhoods? I don't know. I don't think even if I asked, I wouldn't know. Where's the list that I can go and find out and say who's actually accountable, who works in it, how do we get into the discussions and say, look, here's an offering. Just yes, obviously I have a massive bias because I'm working for Flow at the moment, but how could Flow be a part of that conversation? Because those three domains, everything that we talked about in the 10-year plan is satisfied, and many other organizations and devices and things will also do that same. So how are we included?
And people need to challenge within their own organisations as well, I think, about accountability. If there are people, and I think the voice of the clinical safety officer is a weak one within the NHS,
sure.
Because people are sort of like, look, and I get this on a sort of like, I see it on a daily basis because we train like weekly in relation to like bullying tactics and lots of pressure being put in that respect. And I don't know if anyone did see an article came out last week, which I've been asked to comment on by HSJ from LBC. So something that's dear to my heart, it was Barkinghaven and Redbridge. A senior clinician there whistle blew about their EPR deployment, stating that there's not a whole lot of information, and obviously this person remained anonymous for obvious reasons, but they clearly stated that the EPR has caused deaths within the organisation. I think this is one of the first times recently that we've seen something like that. I don't know where that's gone any further or what sort of, but someone's actually demanded, and I think that the HSJ are looking at it in relation to getting a background to say that is there going to be investigation into this, what's going to happen. But for me that's absolutely shocking that sort of I bet you bottom dollar that there's more, but they're just not being talked about in relation to that. So it begs the question, NHS England, where are you in relation to these sort of and where is the team? Because if that sort of story comes out and I see that and I'm working for NHS England and I have a responsibility for digital clinical safety in relation to that, would you not want to be getting involved? Would you not want to be visiting that trust and sort of having, but it's almost as if, and I don't know whether that's happening, and apologies if it is, but surely there should be a team that gets parachuted in, or there's a crisis team, or there's something that go in even just to investigate something like that.
And I expect that's happening, and I hope that's happening. It'd be a real shame if that isn't happening, but we know the legacy, and there's been a lot in the press around this even recently, but just generally the whistleblower, what does it actually mean? How are those individuals treated? There's some of them going to court. The one that comes to mind immediately to me is Chris Day and the whistleblowing thing that he had. I mean, what a terrible journey. You're fighting, again, your principle again is always going to be based in patient safety. You're raising it, and instead of being acknowledged, celebrated almost, that you've recognized something, really, well done on recognizing something, let's now work together to find it out. You're kind of vilified. I mean, that's just outrageous. And it becomes then, when you turn experience or qualitative into quantitative, right, it becomes a number. Well, if it's 1 or 2 or 0.00%, I can live with that. But when you think of that one individual, if that is the case and the EPR that, what does that mean for obviously that individual, the consequences being so horrific, and all those people around them? You can't then put a number on that. You've got to think of it's not acceptable.
No.
Now, I've made mistakes in clinical practice. Everybody does.
We all have.
We need to learn from them. We need to
totally.
investigate them
Of course we
properly.
do.
At the same time, you can't then expect a new tool, as an example, just coming into things. You can't expect that they're going to be 100% safe. You want to aim for 100%, which goes back again to post-market and all that stuff. So you keep on learning. You have a responsibility to do even more and gathering that information and acting on that information.
Yeah. Kultar, we're coming towards the end of the episode. I can't believe we've sort of like, we've nearly been chatting for an hour and a half. I want to leave on a positive note in relation to what we're doing. We've had some great conversations, and I'm sure the audience will have a lot to sort of like think about in relation to that. But if there's sort of, I always do this at the end with our guests. If there's one takeaway in relation to sort of like for the audience in relation to a lot of things we've discussed, what would that be?
Pretty much building on the last point I made. This is not about numbers. Numbers are important, but your responsibility in this sector, in digital health and health tech, the patient is the core. And listen to them, learn from them. We are patients. I'm a patient. Make that your central message. And if you work on that and you get that right and you build on all the learnings, good and bad, and you implement that, you inevitably get commercial success as a consequence. Don't come and force a solution and say, this is what you need. Build and work out what is needed, and then use your brilliant minds to then go and solve for that. And then keep on solving for it. You can have a wonderful product, but it needs to move with the times. So make the patient your core across the business. If you're in a position where you're a clinician, then that is your sole responsibility, and then everything feeds off of that. So always think about that one person, that one number, that tiny percentage it could be. If that was you, how would you act differently? If that was your loved one, how would you act differently? And you've got to treat people and numbers just like that, as being very close and personal to you. Then you'll succeed if you do that.
An absolutely fantastic message to leave with the audience. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to you, Kultar, for joining us on episode 35 of The Only Way is Ethics. Thank you to everyone that has listened. And just to let you know, we are going to be kicking off an artificial intelligence series of The Only Way is Ethics. So stay tuned, and thank you for watching. Thank you again, Kultar.
Thanks, Dean. Thanks, everyone.